Greetings, everybody. This is Roger Thunder with the Red Road channel on YouTube in conjunction with the Red Road blog on Substack. So if you are interested in the indigenous nations and the history of them, you might want to subscribe to both this channel, and I will put a link in the show notes and in the comments section to the Red Road on Substack. That is a way that you can help this viewer-supported endeavor to exist. It's free to subscribe to the Red Road on Substack, so I said I will put a link, and I will. And you can go there and subscribe for free, and then if you wish to support my efforts, you can always upgrade to a paid subscription. Check out the content, see if you like it, that sort of thing. So now I will proceed on with the video for today, which is about the Pueblo Revolution and Pope. Let's start off with Pope. In this picture, he is holding up the rope of 5 knots, and I'll get into that in a minute. But Pope is the man. He is the one that led the Pueblo Revolution. And I might add at this point that this revolution was the only successful native rebellion against the incursion of the European man. It is the only successful one. And there's a long story about how this all started. But this is the man, Pope, P-O-P-A-Y, is a good way to remember that, Pope. Quite the warrior, quite the strategist, quite the chieftain, war chieftain. So let's start first with why this whole Pueblo Revolution had to happen in the first place. And we can go immediately to the perpetrators of this whole fiasco. And it is more than a fiasco. It is a genocidal action against the natives of this land, North American natives. This guy, who do you think he is? Well, that's Christopher Columbus. And he sailed the ocean blue in 1492 and sought out to discover different things like the New World and trade routes and India and a whole bunch of other things that he had been commissioned to do. And he ended up on the shores of Turtle Island, that was the name of America before the incursion of the European man or the white man. This is one of the original perpetrators of that incursion. Now let me mention at this time that 1492 was not the only time that Christopher Columbus came to America. He made several journeys. In the 1400s on into the 1500s, at least 4 or 5 different journeys, coming back and forth. So if people just think he made one journey, he didn't. He made several, bringing in what was ever needed in the way of troops or arms or food for the colonists and that type thing. This is the other perpetrator, Coronado, Spanish explorer. He came into this North American continent in the desert region up through Mexico around the 1600s. Actually, no, it was before that. It was probably around 1500s, maybe 1590, somewhere around there. He had as his big reason, or his orders, or orders from Spain, to come in here and find the lost cities of Cibola, supposedly. Some guy wrote a book, some Spanish guy earlier, some romanticist, some liar, basically, because he described all these cities that the Spanish could explore in North America, and they came up from Mexico, and they were trying to find all kinds of nice things like gold and resources, and they again were of the opinion or the misconception through previous lies that there was some kind of Silk Road and that there were beautiful vistas and huge cities teeming with all kinds of resources that they could basically pillage, is what they were after, that they could take control of. However, when he started his journey up from Mexico and the raids down there on the natives down there, he was to find out that it wasn't such an easy journey, and the land was harsh. As he made his way up through what is now known as Arizona and up into the regions where the Pueblo people had originated. And when I'm talking about Pueblo people here, I'm talking about the Anasazi, the original inhabitants of the Southwest. And off of the Anasazi were all kinds of tribes, like the Hopi and the Ute and the Tiwa and the Apache and all Pueblo tribes. And now these Pueblo tribes that he ran into had no idea who this person was, although they did get they did have a network back then that went clear down to Mexico. So they did get some rumors that there were people afoot. In other words, that there might be somebody showing up. But they didn't know exactly who these people were. All they know is that they were intruding on their space, their land. And so they actually made preparations in case these people showed up. And they did show up, and Coronado brought monks with him, and he brought all the trappings of the Catholic Church. And the mission was, besides finding riches and gold and fabric and textiles and all that stuff, the mission was to whoever they ran into to convert into Christianity through the Catholic religion. Now, after he'd gone over all this rough terrain and found out that the conditions were harsh, and he came upon certain pueblos like Tiwa, the Tiwa Pueblo, I'll get into that here, and other pueblos, and these people, although they were reticent and prepared, they still were ready to welcome people and try to establish some kind of communication and friendly relationship. This is Dowa Yolane. This is a stronghold or a place where the Tiwa, like I said, made preparations. They stored all kinds of things in here waiting for this arrival in case they needed it, like food and water and utensils and weapons or whatever else they would need. It was kind of like a stronghold, kind of like the Masada over in the Middle East was a stronghold. This is another mountain that was a stronghold, only this was in New Mexico. And this is where, again, they stored their stuff. This is a graphic of what it might have looked like when they were coming in. And here you have the conquistadors and the monks, and they actually drug all kinds of people. They actually had captive slaves that they had captured down in in Mexico. Coming up to New Mexico here. Santa Fe, to be exact, that whole area around Santa Fe was where all this stuff really happened. So Santa Fe not only has a rich history in the West as far as cattle drives and rough, rowdy towns and that type of thing, but way before then it was just a Pueblo area. And that was what became the headquarters of the Spanish Incursion, setting up a government, provinces, that type of thing. I want you to remember here that I do this stuff off the top of my head, what I can remember. I don't have teleprompters and notes and all that good stuff, so my dates are basically pretty close. But you can get lost in dates, you can get lost in names of people. Man, there were so many Spanish leaders and warriors, and they had names that went on endlessly, and I could bore you with all that stuff, but I like to just give you a kind of an overall good feeling storytelling type approach to this. You can get lost in the details, basically. So, while I have this picture up, I'm going to have to explain to you some things that happened as they made this incursion in, and this is what caused the Pueblo Revolt and Pope and all that stuff. Basically, when they came in, like I said, they came in dragging their animals. Incidentally, they did bring the horse and mule, which later was if one good thing came out of all this, it was them bringing the horse and mule, which later on spread to the Plains tribes like the Lakota, who became the supreme horsemen. But before that, they were using dogs to carry around things, and they didn't ride horses. So when the horse came in, it was kind of like a whole new ball game as far as what the native people could do and how they could get around and how they could actually do warriorship and hunting and all that, hunting the buffalo and all that stuff. But that's a whole nother story. But when they came in, what they did is the first thing they tried to do is lay the heavy hand of the Christianity thing on these people. They didn't like the people, and they didn't they just tolerated the people. They were there to establish a foothold, but they got into all kinds of problems because, of course, the indigenous, beautiful people of this land had their own spirituality, and they had a lot of things that surrounded this spirituality, like objects and kachinas and paintings and just a rich, rich history. There were at least, just in this area alone, probably about 60,000 natives in the different pueblos that again originated from the Anasazi people. Beautiful culture. They had trade. They were trading even as far as down into New Mexico and with the natives on the East Coast and that type thing. So they had a rich culture. They were thriving. They had no problems except with nature and the famine and the starvation and the stuff that they had to deal with because of the harshness of the land, which these guys here, the conquistadors, ran into. They didn't expect that at all. They probably expected lush gardens and flowing waters, and they had all kinds of dreams of grandeur. Now, when they got to Tiwa, this guy got to Tiwa, In other pueblos, which I will show you a picture of, like the Acoma Pueblo, when they found out that this story wasn't true that they heard about gaining all these riches, instead of taking it out on the people that had misled them in the first place and told them that this is what they would find, instead of taking that out on the liars, what they did is they took it out on the people that inhabited these pueblos. And there were rich variety of people. Like I said before, there were many factions, the Utes, the Paiutes, the all over this southwest area, the Hopi, the Navajo, the Apache. The list just goes on and on and on. Now these people were pretty much autonomous in their own regions. All right, there was no unification, there was no confederacy of nations in the Southwest. They knew who each other were, they traded with each other, and they had occasional wars with each other, but not like this, okay? So when the Spanish came in and tried to enforce their precepts or their religion or their ideology or their Christianity on the natives, it was totally foreign to them. Now the natives did try to comply to some degree, but there were brutal incidents, okay? So some of the stuff that the Spanish did to the natives was any man over the age of 24. They considered them all a threat, like I say, and any man over the age of 24 had his foot cut off. Forget what it was, his right foot, I think it was. Well, that's just completely devastating those people's lives. They couldn't work, they farmed, they had to walk around. Cutting their feet off was a big thing with the conquistadors against the natives. They also liked to rape their women, the native women, because obviously there wasn't a whole bunch of women around, and so they went after them. And then they also used captives as slaves. They would capture people and use them as slaves for the viceroy or whoever it was over there that was issuing out the orders. They also did other things like they ordered people to destroy their ritual objects like the cachinas. I'll show a picture of them in a minute. And their trappings and anything, even their arts and culture, they outlawed or basically said that you're not going to live that way anymore. This is all fact, people. They also did things like in different areas, like with the Hopi people and at different pueblos, and specifically the Acoma Pueblo. I'll get to that because that caused the uprising. They would hang people and burn them alive, burn them at the stake. These are the nice guys that came in and wanted to bring Christianity and the ideology of the European man to the peaceful natives, fairly peaceful, that welcomed them with open arms. Again, just like what happened on the East Coast. They always gave people the benefit of the doubt. Well, let's see what they're all about. Here's a picture I did of one of the pueblos. It was actually taken from a photograph. But this is how they lived. This is, of course, later on because it has this type of door. But this was actually the Acoma and the Taos pueblos looked pretty much the same. I think I have a picture here of the Taos Pueblo. Here's a picture, kind of a postcard picture of the Taos Pueblo. Not the best picture in the world, but gives you an idea how they lived and how they were living and how these people existed on this harsh land, this harsh territory. Here's a picture of the Tiwas people's Pueblo, the ruins of it. But you can see how the construction was built, and you can see that they were very organized, and they were had a real good, strong community. Here it is. This is the picture of the, like I showed you earlier, of the one I painted. This is the Taos. I keep wanting to say Tao because it's so similar. The Taos Pueblo. And again, beautiful structures, which were later on, to this day, taken over and lived in by the native people in that area of Santa Fe. Now let's come back to Pope and the 5 knots and how all this came about. So I covered why this came about in the first part of this video. And let me continue on a little bit more with why. So I believe that Pope was in one of the pueblos in the New Mexican area. And there, by this time, all kinds of, this was like 1680, I believe it was August 11th, 1680, that this took place. Now, around that time, right shortly before that time, what happened is that Pope, he was a medicine man. He was a spiritual leader, much like Crazy Horse or Sitting Bull or any of the other famous medicine men in the tribal nation. And he wasn't the only one. There were more medicine men, and they were considered, the Spaniards considered them dangerous because they, being of a spiritual nature, the people followed them. That was their religion. That was their spirituality. And so, in order to keep the people from following them, they would do things like destroy religious objects, like the Kachinas. Let me just flash to the Kachinas here for a minute, and I'll come right back to Pope. Here's a picture of some Kachinas. There were all kinds of names, and these were beautiful sculptures out of wood and feathers and that type of thing that the indigenous people, the Puebloan people, carried with them or had in their houses, and each one had a different representation, like the Corn Mother and maybe the Hopi god Masao and the Badger, and mostly having to do with nature and their emergence. There's stories of emergence through the time of when they populated this land, and had strong spiritual significance to them. These are the Kachinas, and there was equivalent to the Kachinas in the other traditions, like the Navajo tradition, and they had different names. Basically, they all had this type of appearance. Here's another picture of a Kachina that I painted, and this is called the long-hair Kachina. And this is one of their one of the objects of their let's say mythology and religion. Now here's another picture I did of a Kachina, and this looks kind of like a ferocious type dude, doesn't he? Well, this is called the priest killer. This is the priest killer Kachina. And he had rattles and a spear and feathers, and but this came later. This came after, and I was going to show this later, but I figured I might as well show it now. This came after the rebellion to depict what went on. So let me get back to Pope here real quick. So at the time that all these artifacts and religious objects were being destroyed. Of course, Pope and the other medicine men and leaders had had about enough of this, because by this time in 1680, remember, the Spanish first came in here in the 1500s, so we're talking about 100 years of occupation is what we're talking about here. 100 years of occupation. You might liken that to the 75 years of occupation that is happening in Palestine right now, but that's another story. Same story, only different time. The Spanish had made incursions, and Santa Fe was kind of like the headquarters of their empire. And they had governors, and they had provinces, and they were really starting to integrate and take over the indigenous population and to subjugate them, make slaves out of them, torture them, again, cutting off their feet and hands and stuff like that. So Pope and his fellow warriors or fellow associates had about enough of this, and they started making a display of their anger in the form verbally and telling the people this and that, and so that immediately got these guys in trouble. And what they did is they arrested I don't know how many scores of medicine men and leaders and Pope himself, and they sentenced them to death, and they hung a bunch of them. And Pope somehow they would also do things like sentence these people to slavery or 25 years in prison or anything that they deemed was appropriate to squelch this opposition. And Pope did finally get back out of prison somehow and got out into the populace. I'm not sure exactly how that happened. He may have been released. But the first thing that he did was take off and go to the Pueblo. And he decided right then and there, he made a firm decision that this had to end, okay, and that the Spanish needed to be pushed out of the country, liquidated, and all remnants of their ever having been here would be destroyed. I mean, everything. He wanted everything removed. He wanted this incursion stopped, and rightly so for his people. And so he formed a sort of confederacy. And this was all underground. So I think that he traveled for 5 years while hiding in this Pueblo, mind you. He would make trips out to other parts of the Southwest, and it took him 5 years to make contact with the people like the Hopi and the Apache, people who knew of each other and weren't exactly friends sometimes, but come to find out they had one common hatred or one thing in common, and that was the incursion of the European man, the Spaniards, into this land that was theirs and disrupting their religious practices. They had all these things in common because it wasn't just one tribe or one group of people that were going through this. It was all of them. They were subjugating everybody. They were raping and pillaging and torturing, basically. And so this guy had the cojones, okay, to and the smarts and this, the strategic mindset, great strategist, to travel all those years, 5 years, to all these pueblos and get everybody on the same page to form a confederacy to tribes before that were basically, again, like I said before, enemies, or not enemies even, but they traded, but they just weren't close. They had no organization. This guy organized everybody. He was an organizer. And during this organization, he would send out runners to the different tribes. And so at this point, his whole modus operandi, shall we say, was to organize a revolt, to organize a rebellion, a physical rebellion, to throw the bums out, basically. And that's exactly what he did. Now, this is an interesting picture because this rope with the 5 knots in it had meaning. And what that meaning was is he would send out, when he sent out his runners, he sent them out with this rope with 5 knots for all the different tribes. And this was like a stopwatch. This was like a timepiece. This was like every day you will untie a knot, or I can't remember what the time length was, but when it came down to revolt, the timing was important. So he would have them untie a knot at every interval. Again, I can't remember what that interval was, but and as they untied the knots, as they went down the rope and untied the knots, when they got to the last knot, it would be time for the revolution to begin, or the uprising to begin. And there were specific instructions for these uprisings, and they were as follows. First thing you do when you reach that final knot on that day is you go in and you take out all the churches, all the priests, all the leaders, all the governors, anything that had to do with Spanish, you would attack that first. And so the plan was set. He put this all in motion. And so, long story short, and I could bore you with all kinds of details, but I won't. Long story short is because of the incursion of the Spanish, and they really seeped into culture. In other words, they had a bunch of people eventually, after 100 years. They had a bunch of people, even in the tribes, that were converted over and intermarried, and there was all kinds of Spanish Christian influence, and some people had decided that they wanted to follow Christianity, and others were traditionalists and decided that no, that was the wrong way to go. And they were right. The traditionalists were right. Because the more you allow an incursion, the more you allow a ideology or mindset to be accepted, you have problems, because then you got traitors. So back to the 5 knots thing, that was one big thing that they were afraid of, is that who do we inform in these different tribes that are the traditionalists, and trying to keep their plans secret, a security type thing, if you will. And so that had to come into play as well. And even Pope was he was hardcore about this. I think he even had his own son-in-law. What would that be? His daughter's husband, I guess. Had him killed because he was a sympathizer for the Spaniards. He was too integrated into that, and he was too close to the family. That's how passionate he was about carrying out this plan. And even though all those security measures were taken, the plan leaked out. It leaked out somehow about when they got down to the last knot. They tortured people. They captured people. What they did, I think, is they captured some runners, now that recollection serves me. They captured some runners that were taking these messages back and forth, and the ones that also carried the ropes. And they tortured them until they told them the date that this was supposed to happen, or approximate date, or maybe the exact date even, according to the knots. And it was revealed, and Pope found this out. So again, what he had to do was he had to reestablish, he had to send more runners and say, let's make it the next day, not the day they think it is. Well, some of them got the message and some of them didn't, is long story short on that one. And so they just went according to the knot thing, and they took off, but it still worked because it was so ferocious. So all these different tribes in the different areas, the Hopi, the Apache, the Ute, all of these different tribes did exactly what he said that day, and that's what started the rebellion. That's what started the revolt. And it was massive. And then the next day, more joined in. Even though that the Spaniards knew about this, they were overwhelmed by it. They got their butts kicked, basically. And it was a rout, because what they did is, even the Hopi people and all of them, they did things like, now we get back to that priest killer Kachina that I showed you, which I said came later. What they did is they threw the priests, they went into the missions and killed the priests, or a lot of them got thrown off cliffs. And they basically took their power back. They took their religion. They burned the missions. They got rid of everything that they could that had anything to do with the Spanish and the Conquistadors and the Catholic Church. They did a rout on them. And this continued on. See, so there's so many dates here and everything. I could never remember it just off the top of my head, but you're getting the heartfelt story here. Let's put it that way. You're getting the heartfelt story of this. So what happened after this? Well, it came to a point where they finally decided to escort the Spaniards out of the territory. Now, they let them escape, actually, so they did have some compassion. There was a lot of intermarriage going on, and there were families that believed this way and that, and some sided with the Spaniards. And so they let them go off on these different excursions towards Mexico to get them out of there. But they shadowed them all the way. They followed them all the way to the border just to make sure they were gone. And this basically, what this did to the Spanish rule at that time was caused it no longer to be. I mean, it just basically collapsed. You know, the governors and all this stuff drove them out completely. So they did. It was a successful native uprising against the perpetrators of violence and enforced ideology and just the rape of this land and its people. They forced them out. Good for them. 12 years they stayed out. Okay, you know that they're you know that they're going to come back, just like Columbus came back time and time again, and you know they're going to continue on to try to be authoritarian and dominant and all this stuff. And for the most part, they kept them out. There were times when the Spanish tried to come in again, and they drove them out again. And it was a continual thing after the 12 years. It seemed like, okay, here they come again. And Pope himself, after the Spanish were driven out, was made a head of like a type of a governor, but I wouldn't call it a governor. I would call it a chief or a head of a council. And so he was raised up into power. And he had this this thought in his mind, okay, that he basically wanted to get rid of everything that existed as far as the Spanish were concerned. And so he gave a proclamation out that said all this stuff had to be destroyed. Everything that had anything to do with Spanish people and the fact that they were here. And I'm talking everything. I'm talking about everything. Even he didn't even want families. He dissolved marriages that were performed under the auspices of the Catholic Church and said, you're going to do this the native way now. If you want that same woman, fine. If you don't want her, find somebody else, but do it the native way. And he even got down to the point of any remembrance, and so it got kind of dicey because there were a lot of things like pots and pans and innovations and even the culture, a lot of the culture mixed in, and basically it was an uphill battle for Pope to try to dissolve this stuff, and there were divisions that occurred within families, and there were quarrels, and there were one tribe wanted to do this and one didn't, and he tried to hold it together the best he could. He tried it tried his spirit, I'm sure, and it was almost like a losing battle. It was in fact a losing battle because here comes another guy in at this time, okay? So another guy, another Spanish guy, thinks it's his mission to go back and take back what was lost in the way of property and everything from Spain. So here comes this guy, a guy named De Vargas. And I think, like I said, this was about 12 years later. And he came in armed to the teeth. He came in ready. And he made an onslaught against the Pueblo people. And he did retake. See, that was the time it was retaken by this guy. And he did the same thing, of course, that the other people did. Punishments, tortures, vindictive behavior against the people because of the rebellion. And so basically the rebellion was successful, but it took 12 years for the Spanish to reorganize and come back in and and they did. There were all kinds of battles that ensued during this period. Now, during this battle, here's a picture called the Palace of the Governors. I think that's it. Palace of the Governors. Yeah, that's what it is. I was actually at this place in Santa Fe and made a journey there with a friend, and we went to this Palace of the Governors, and it's right near the plaza in Santa Fe, and you can actually, all the natives lay out their goods in this whole area along here where these pillars are, and then you got the plaza over here out of sight. But This palace of the governors is a notable place because when de Vargas was coming back in, or during that period of time when there were battles going on, at one time there was a battle that surrounded this place. Basically, this place was taken over by Spanish people that were trying to get away from the Pueblo Revolt, or let's say that it might not have been the Pueblo, it might have been later with de Vargas. But at any rate, it was all in the same kind of time period there where there was battles going on, and a bunch of people hid in here and was kind of like trying to protect themselves like a fort, Spaniards that is. And eventually de Vargas or somebody came in here and rescued them and took them out of here. So that's a famous ex-stronghold, or let's say a place where they try to defend themselves. A lot occurred around here, so it's got a lot of history. Yeah, so this de Vargas came back, and he reinstituted the governorship, and he did all kinds of things that had been done before. And it did bring some type of order. Now, see, there were mixed feelings about the Spaniards, like I say, because they had been ingratiated themselves so much. At this time, after all these people, Pueblo people, after all they'd been through, they looked at because they were facing famine, and they were facing food shortages, they were facing extinction, harsh weather, harsh living conditions. At times, life wasn't easy. And there were certain things that the Spaniards brought in, like utensils and all this stuff, and it was almost like a Stockholm syndrome. Basically, if your enemy captures you, you start identifying with him. That's basically what happens in the Stockholm syndrome. You establish a relationship. It might not be a real true friendship or anything like that, but it evolved, and the Spaniards, to their credit, at this time decided that the harsh somebody up somewhere, some viceroy somewhere, had a bingo moment, a moment of enlightenment, and decided that maybe that wasn't the right approach, to go in there and forcibly make these people adhere to the will of the church and all this stuff. So basically they relaxed their position. And it took all this torture and all this death and all this aggravation. And they didn't do it because they loved the people, trust me. They did it because it would be easier for them to implement their rule and their laws and goods and services, and just growth for them all the way around. So that's why they wanted to do this, not particularly like they love the indigenous people or anything. Now I think I'll throw up a few graphics after the fact here of that I like that depicted this type of thing. I think this is a beautiful graphic that shows the revolt and just the sureness and the courageousness of these people. Here's another monument that stands in New Mexico to this day, and this represents the different runners that went off with the rope to the different nations, different tribes. And also they have a dance, not a dance, they have a run that they do, I think it's every year, that commemorates, not a marathon or anything like that, just a run, a traditional ritual run to represent and thank and revere the runners that had to go out and carry these ropes with knots in them to the different nations. Here's an awesome mural that I found that represents the battle between the natives and the conquistadors. I believe this is somewhere on a wall in a museum or something in New Mexico. Nice portrayal. Here is a sculpture that is in New Mexico of Pope, and it is said these are the 5 knots up here on the top of his head. I really like this sculpture. Whoever did it was just amazing and really kind of grabbed the whole essence of what it was all about. And I will finish up this video with this awesome sculpture or statue of Pope in New Mexico. What does it say here? Down at the bottom, try not to block it out here. New Mexico, Pope, holy man, farmer, defender, leader of the Indian Pueblo Revolt, Okay Owinge. Okay, that's the Pueblo that I couldn't remember before that he was at. Okay Owinge, which is the San Juan Pueblo. That's what it's known as. Very nice depiction and commemoration of Pope. So that wraps up this video from this storyteller, wisdom keeper, and representative of the Red Road and the indigenous people. Like and subscribe to this video if you will, and or this channel, and like I said at the beginning, subscribe to my Substack, because there's all kinds of stuff on there that I don't have on YouTube. Articles, videos, stories, publishing my books in a serial version. And if you really want to help me out and support my efforts, subscribe to the Red Road and do a yearly subscription or a pledge. I think you have choices as to what you would like to do when you go on there, and hit the link in the show notes and in the commentary section. So until next time, this is Roger Thunder saying Wopila Aho.